In May 1942, the MG42 was officially adopted by the German Afrika Korps. It was the first successful example of a modern machine gun, killing more Allied infantry than any other weapon on the battlefield. But the crew behind the gun faced horrors few men can stomach. See, there were 5 specific elements on the battlefield that turned the operator's life into actual misery. But at the time, the MG42 was by far one of the best weapons you could get your hands on as an infantryman. It had a staggering cyclic rate of 1,500 rounds per minute, and every single rifleman in the field was there to protect it. So why was the life behind the MG42 still so dangerous? And what horrors awaited Allied soldiers on the other end of the barrel? Okay, so to fully understand what these crews went through, you need to understand how the Germans actually built their squads, because they did it completely differently from the Allies. Most Allied armies built their squads around the riflemen, like the classic M1 Garand or the British Lee Enfield. And in this structure, the machine gun was just a support weapon, something that helped the riflemen do their job. The Germans flipped that idea completely on its head. In a standard German infantry group of about 10 men, the entire squad revolved around the MG42 in the light machine gun role, or the older MG34 before it. You had the gunner who carried and fired the weapon, and the assistant gunner who carried the tripod and helped feed the belts. And then you had the rest of the squad, usually 5 or 6 riflemen, whose only real purpose was to carry ammunition, spare barrels, and keep the gun crew alive. Studies after the war estimated that a German infantry platoon equipped with MG34s and MG42s had roughly 1.6 times the firepower of a comparable Allied platoon, and almost all of that advantage came from the machine guns alone. So while an American squad relied on Garands and a single BAR, putting out maybe 500 rounds per minute on a good day, the German squad could lay down over 1,200 rounds per minute from just one single MG42. And when crews operated from a Lafette tripod with the telescopic sight attached, they could deliver accurate sustained fire at ranges well beyond 1,000 meters, using both direct and indirect fire techniques developed all the way back in the First World War. All of that leads us here, the Eastern Front, where the MG42 first proved itself in large numbers, and it was also the place where its crews suffered the most out of the entire war. By the winter of 1942, German soldiers were fighting in conditions that dropped well below -40 degrees, which sometimes caused the operators' hands to literally freeze to the metal. Now, the designers at the Grossfuss factory, which made the MG42, had actually thought about this problem. Both the cocking handle and the catch for the top cover were specifically shaped so that soldiers could operate them while wearing thick Arctic mittens, or even with a stick if their gloves were gone. But in practice, the Eastern Front had a way of destroying every careful plan the engineers had ever made. See, changing the hot barrel while wearing bulky mittens in the middle of a firefight was one thing on a training ground in Germany, and something entirely different when Soviet flamethrowers were charging your position at 3 in the morning, and the barrel needed to be changed often, at about 200 rounds fired. So frostbite became one of the most common casualties on the Eastern Front, and machine gun crews were hit especially hard because their weapon demanded constant physical contact with large exposed metal surfaces. The German government actually tried to suppress reports about how bad the frostbite problem had gotten back home, calling it exaggerated chatter, and ordering propaganda speakers to combat the rumors, but the numbers were impossible to hide. Tens of thousands of German soldiers suffered frostbite injuries during the first winter alone, and a significant portion of those were machine gunners and their assistants. And frostbite was only the beginning of what the Eastern Front had in store for these men. The fighting in the East was on a scale that the Western Allies could barely imagine. Around 30 million people died on that front over 4 years, and the brutality between German and Soviet forces went far beyond anything on the Western and Italian front. Many crews even reported firing their barrels until they glowed a light cherry red, going through all 6 spare barrels in a single engagement, and still watching more soldiers move towards their position. And in such engagements, one of the most common tactical problems was ammunition. The MG42's rate of fire meant that even with the entire squad carrying belts, it could burn through 1,800 rounds of their standard load in a matter of minutes during a major attack. And resupply on the Eastern Front was unreliable at the best of times, and during the encirclements and retreats that became increasingly common after Stalingrad, it was often impossible. German machine gun crews would strip belts from the dead, scavenge from destroyed positions, and sometimes resort to rationing their fire to just a few rounds per burst because they genuinely did not know when the next resupply would arrive. So we've talked about the horrors of the Eastern Front, but somehow that was far from the darkest part. See, the MG42 fired so fast that you genuinely couldn't distinguish individual shots. Allied soldiers described the sound as ripping cloth or the buzzing of a chainsaw, and the Germans gave it their own names too. Hitlersage, meaning Hitler's saw, and Knochensage, which literally means bone saw. But while the Allies feared that sound from the receiving end, the men behind the weapon had to live with watching what 1,200 rounds per minute actually did to their victims. And perhaps no story shows this better than what happened to Heinrich Sevelow on June 6, 1944. Sevelow was a 20-year-old farm boy from northern Germany, conscripted into the Wehrmacht and assigned as an orderly to Lieutenant Bernhard Fröking at Widerstandsnest 62, a strong point overlooking Omaha Beach. He had never fired a shot before that fateful morning, and his previous posting on the Eastern Front had been cut short by frostbite and a punishment detail after he complained about the food. On D-Day, he found himself behind an MG42 about 450 meters from where the first American landing craft dropped their ramps. His orders were simply to open fire when the enemy was knee-deep in the water and unable to run. According to his own account, Sevelow fired that MG42 from 6:30 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon, roughly 9 straight hours. He claimed to have burned through around 12,000 rounds from the MG42 and another 400 from 2 Carabiner 98K rifles when the gun was cooling down, while an unknown German sergeant kept running back and forth to the ammunition bunker to keep him supplied. Now, historians dispute his exact casualty figures, and some consider them implausible given that total Allied casualties across all 10 kilometers of Omaha Beach were around 2,400, but what nobody disputes is what that day did to him. Decades later, Sevelow said it was definitely at least 1,000 men, most likely more, and that thinking about it made him physically sick. One moment never left him: a young American who had crouched behind a concrete block on the beach for cover. Sevelow aimed his rifle and hit the man in the forehead. The helmet flew off into the surf and the soldier collapsed where he stood. That image visited Sevelow every night for the rest of his life, and it took him 40 years before he could even begin to process what happened at Omaha Beach. He eventually tracked down an American chaplain named David Silver who had been wounded by 3 bullets in the chest that same morning, meaning there was a real chance Sevelow himself had pulled the trigger. The two men formed a friendship that lasted until Sevelow died in 2006 at the age of 82. Now, Sevelow's story gets attention because of its scale, but the psychological damage from operating an MG42 wasn't limited to situations like his. See, the rate of fire meant that an MG42 gunner saw the effects of his work in a way that a rifleman simply never did, and it was loud, extremely loud, often causing the crew to suffer severe hearing loss. A rifleman could maybe shoot 2 or 3 troops before he himself was taken out of action, but an MG42 gunner watches sustained bursts tear through groups of soldiers at once, while the weapon demands his full attention to stay on target. And as bad as that was, the possibility of capture was even more frightening. On the Western Front, most German soldiers who surrendered to American or British forces could expect to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Less than 1/3 of 1% of German prisoners held by Western Allied forces died in captivity, but MG42 crews were in a different category. These were the men who had been shredding Allied infantry for hours before their position was overrun, and the soldiers doing the overrunning had often lost friends in the process. After particularly brutal engagements, German machine gunners were sometimes executed on the spot rather than taken prisoner. This wasn't official policy, but frontline troops on all sides developed their own rules about who deserved quarter and who didn't, and machine gunners frequently ended up on the wrong side of that. And after the Malmedy massacre in December 1944, when Waffen-SS soldiers gunned down 84 American prisoners of war, things got considerably worse. The 328th Infantry Regiment issued written orders that no SS troops or paratroopers were to be taken prisoner, and in practice, the distinction between a regular Wehrmacht machine gunner and an SS one wasn't always clear to an angry rifleman who had just watched his squad get torn apart. On the Eastern Front, the situation was incomparably worse. German forces had waged what historians call a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, starving an estimated 57% of all Soviet prisoners to death. So when the tide turned, the treatment German soldiers received reflected years of built-up hatred. Around 1/3 of all Germans captured by the Soviets died in captivity, and for machine gunners specifically, the chances were significantly lower than that. Soviet soldiers executed German machine gun crews immediately after overrunning positions, and MG42 gunners who had caused heavy casualties could expect the same treatment that German snipers got, which often meant torture before execution. This knowledge filtered back through the ranks, and the result was that many MG42 crews on the Eastern Front fought to the last round rather than risk being taken alive. This deep hatred also caused the MG42 crews to become priority targets, and this was by far the darkest truth about life as a German machine gunner. See, the moment an MG42 opened fire, every enemy soldier within earshot knew exactly where it was. No other weapon on the battlefield produced that tearing roar, and Allied troops were specifically trained to recognize it. Allied doctrine had one objective when it came to MG42 positions: kill the gun crew as fast as possible and as the first thing, because every second that gun was alive, the Allies were bleeding troops. American and British infantry were taught to identify the firing position during a burst and then rush the gun during the few seconds it took to change barrels. At the MG42's rate of fire, barrel changes came roughly every 8 to 12 seconds of continuous shooting, so crews had a window of about 5 to 7 seconds where the gun went silent. Snipers were another constant problem, because the gunner had to hold a fixed position with his head and upper body exposed, and a trained sniper could pick him off from well beyond the MG42's effective range. And even if the sniper only killed the number one gunner, the assistant had to crawl forward and take over in the exact same spot that just got the previous man killed. If an allied observer spotted the position, he could call in artillery that would obliterate everything within a 30-meter radius. German doctrine required crews to set up alternate positions and move frequently, but in practice, moving the gun meant giving up the firing angles that made it effective. So crews often stayed put and hoped the shells would miss, and many didn't. In Normandy's bocage country, the fighting became intensely personal, with visibility sometimes less than 100 meters. American soldiers learned that the only way to deal with an MG42 in the hedgerows was to pin it from the front, while a flanking team worked around to grenade range, which meant the crew's first sign of trouble was often a grenade landing in their position from a soldier they never saw. MG42 gunners had some of the highest casualty rates of any position in the German infantry, because the gun was the most valuable thing in the squad, and it attracted everything the enemy could throw at it. And as if all of that wasn't enough, the weapon itself had one more brutal way of punishing the men who operated it. At 1,200 rounds per minute, the MG42's barrel could reach temperatures that would warp and destroy the metal if the crew didn't change it in time. Soldiers were trained to swap roughly every 150 to 250 rounds, which is why squads carried up to 6 spare barrels and were drilled to complete the change in under 7 seconds. You unlatched a lever on the right side of the weapon, swung it outward, slid the hot barrel out to the rear, slotted in the fresh one, and locked it back. No tools required, and the whole process was actually well designed. But the barrel that came out was hot enough to cause third-degree burns on contact. The assistant gunner was issued a pair of asbestos mittens for this task, and in theory, that worked fine. In practice, those mittens were one of the first things to get lost or destroyed in combat, and soldiers described grabbing white hot barrels with bare hands because the gun had to keep firing or everyone was going to die. The resulting burns sometimes permanently damaged the assistant gunner's hands to the point where he couldn't hold a weapon properly afterward. And even with the mittens, crews who went through multiple barrel changes in a single engagement often ended up with blistered palms regardless, because the heat radiated straight through the material. And if a crew pushed past the recommended interval because they were under too much pressure to pause, the barrel would deform and accuracy would drop to almost nothing, with rounds keyholing or flying wildly off target. So the MG42 was arguably the most effective infantry weapon of the Second World War, and its design was so sound that modernized versions are still in service today, with the German Bundeswehr as the MG3. But the men who operated it froze on the steppes of Russia, burned their hands on their own barrels, and if they were unlucky enough to survive all of that and then get captured, the soldiers on the other side often weren't interested in taking prisoners. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing.